Hi, I'm Jenny Miller of Let's Get Sewing. Are you ready to take the fear and frustration out of your sewing experience and finally get sewing? Then you're in the right place. Be sure to click subscribe so you don't miss any of my tips and tutorials. And check out the caption too. There's a link to my website where you can find out more about my course, Conquer Your Sewing Machine, and future courses that I have coming. And now, let's get sewing. Today, I want to talk to you about some sewing terms that are just good to know. But before I get started, I wanted to talk a little bit about what I'm wearing today because I always try to wear something that I've made for my videos for obvious reasons. But today, I am wearing a Levi's shirt, but I added to the shirt these patches, some fun patches. There's another one on the back. The shirt was thrifted from a thrift store and it came with a stain on the shoulder, so I added some Sashiko here. But I just want to give a shout out to my friend Amy. I will tag her Instagram account in the description so that you can learn a little bit more about these patches. But they're all handmade, hand embroidered on just thrifted or pieces of scrap fabric that she comes across and puts them together and makes these wonderful pieces of art. So had to give Amy a little shout out first. But now let's get to some of the sewing terms that I thought might be helpful for you. So the first ones relate to your fabric. And if you follow my Facebook page, every other Friday I do a Fabric Friday and I talk about a lot of these terms, but I wanted to share them on here as well because I know I have followers, different followers on each of the different platforms. So I wanted to talk to you about the grain of the fabric versus the cross grain versus the selvage, which may all be terms that you've heard but don't completely understand. So I have a little scrap of fabric here that I'm going to illustrate those with. So when a weaver sits down to their loom, they're sitting at a big machine with threads stretched very tight this direction. And they take a shuttle and pass it back and forth between all of those threads to form the fabric. If you've never seen a weaving loom before, I would Google it and just see some images and even some videos of people weaving. It's fascinating to watch. And I always tell people that if I had time for another hobby, that might be my next hobby because it looks fun and fascinating to me. But anyway, we have the threads going this direction. They weave threads back and forth in this direction, forming the fabric. Every time that shuttle turns around at the side, it forms the selvage of the fabric. Now, stick with me here because I'm going to bring it all together. The threads going this way on the loom are the grain of the fabric, or we sometimes say the lengthwise grain of fabric. We interchange the two quite a bit. So either one of those means the same thing. When you roll fabric off the bolt, that is the long grain of the fabric. The crosswise grain of the fabric are the threads that go back and forth this way. And so the crosswise grain is only as wide as your fabric is wide, whereas the lengthwise grain runs as long as you can roll that fabric out off the bolt. Like I said, every time you turn around with that shuttle at the side of the fabric, it forms an edge of the fabric that we call the selvage. And on this particular fabric, I use this as my example because they have also printed a pretty design along the selvage to help you know right away which is the lengthwise grain of the fabric. Now remember, these long ones are the lengthwise grain, and as they weave the pieces back and forth, they turn around and go back the other way. That forms a selvage along the edge. So we have the lengthwise grain, we have the cross grain, and we have the selvage. Two other terms relating to the grain of fabric that are helpful to know are bias, which is a 45 degrees to the grain of the fabric. So if this is our lengthwise grain, we're going at a 45 degree or cross grain of the fabric. You'll also hear the term off grain, and that usually refers to a mistake that's been made. Not always, but 90% of the time, it's a mistake that has been made. When we cut out the clothing, we want them on the lengthwise grain. That's usually the best way they hang on the body, or on that 45-degree bias, which can also make a beautiful design. But if you cut it out just a little bit off grain, the fabric wants to hang straight, and so it's continuously trying to pull back to the straight grain and twisting around the body. So if you've ever purchased some cheap clothing that was always twisting around your body, it was cut off grain. That means it wasn't on the lengthwise grain, it wasn't on the crosswise grain, it wasn't on the bias, it was just cut off grain a little bit. Now, that refers to the grain of the fabric, but you see another term on your pattern when you're cutting out fabric, and that is the grain line. When we're talking about the grain line, we are talking about this printed symbol on the pattern piece, and that line runs parallel to the selvage of the fabric. So if I were cutting out this fabric using this pattern, I would lay it out to cut it out, making sure that this line stayed parallel to the selvage of the fabric. So the grain line is on the pattern, and it usually runs with the lengthwise grain of fabric. Another thing relating to both of these terms that I want to show you is called your cutting layout diagram, and that comes in your pattern. And it usually looks something like this. This is illustrating the lengthwise grain of the fabric, or the selvage, along this edge or along both edges, and how the pattern pieces lay out, or the layout design, on the fabric to be cut out in the most efficient way, how the pattern pieces will fit in there to get as many pattern pieces on the fabric as you can and waste as little fabric as possible. And so, again, if we were to put this up, this would be the way the fabric is laying out, and this would be my pattern piece laying along the grain line of the fabric. And you can see that illustrated in some of these pictures here. Those pattern pieces are put parallel to the selvage of the fabric. So your cutting layout diagram will go with the lengthwise grain of fabric and show you how to orient your grain line with the selvage of the fabric. There are so many sewing terms that are helpful when you're getting ready to sew a garment. And so I have put together a glossary of sewing terms that you need when sewing your first sewing project. And I have incorporated them in with my latest course, Conquer Garment Sewing. Conquer Garment Sewing is not quite open for enrollment yet. I'm putting the finishing touches on the course right now. But I'm going to put a link in the description so that you can get on the wait list and find out more about the course when it's ready to open, and be able to get the glossary when you enroll for the course. So check out the link and get on the wait list. Doesn't cost you anything to be on the wait list. You will get all the latest information that you need about my upcoming course. And I will walk you through all of these terms and all of the terms in your pattern, as well as how to choose the pattern, and then we're going to walk through a special project. So get on the wait list. You'll get more details about that. And now, let's get sewing. Thank you for joining me today. My goal is to take the frustration out of your sewing experience, and so I hope my tips are helpful. Feel free to comment with any questions or ideas you may have. I will try to get back to you as soon as I can. Now, let's get sewing.